In the closed archives of the Athenian courts lies a typewritten document from 1977. This dry legal agreement settles financial claims in the amount of $26 million. It was signed by the young heiress of a global shipping empire and the former First Lady of the United States of America. But the true weight of this paper lies not in the number of zeros. The most striking detail of the document is a strict, uncompromising clause forever prohibiting the recipient from setting foot on the private island of Scorpios and approaching the family patriarch's grave without the written permission of the girl who wrote the check. This was a monument of rejection, cast in the form of a legal ultimatum. The world is accustomed to seeing only the shining facade of this dynasty, the triumph of absolute power and boundless wealth. Ocean tankers, carrying oil for entire nations. Private islands planted with trees brought from all over the world, and yachts with bar counters made of polished wood and lapis lazuli, where Winston Churchill and Frank Sinatra conversed in the evenings. Society watched a family that seemed to exist outside the laws of gravity and ordinary human problems. Yet behind the flashes of reporters' cameras and the golden interiors hid a completely different reality. The unyielding will of one titan turned great ambition into a deaf cage for those he intended to elevate above the rest of humanity. One of the heirs attempted to break free from this control into the sky, dreaming of freedom at the controls of an airplane. But his flight ended in a fatal finale on a concrete runway. The second heiress wrested the empire from outsiders, cleared the board of directors, and achieved a historic victory in the brutal, male-dominated business. But her life was tragically cut short in the guest room of someone else's house on another continent, surrounded by ringing loneliness. The third figure, having received all the keys to the colossal fortune, simply erased her name from the society chronicles, choosing the greatest luxury of our time: the right to become absolutely invisible. How is the climate formed in which such a chain of events becomes inevitable? In 1953, the Greek magnate acquires a decommissioned Canadian frigate and rebuilds it into the most luxurious private vessel on the planet. He names it after his 3-year-old daughter. Children grow up on decks where global politics are made, and deals worth hundreds of millions are concluded. Their childhood was the transnational nomadic life of the ultra-rich. Spacious apartments on Paris's Avenue Foch, a historic estate on the French Riviera, exclusive boarding schools in Switzerland and Britain. Yet behind this dazzling splendor lay a profound emotional vacuum, dictated by the spirit of the age and the nature of great capital. The father was absorbed in building an unprecedented fleet and in high-profile romances. He was a man of an era when the scale of influence was measured by the tonnage of ships, and he sincerely believed that by conquering the world, he was expressing devotion to his family. His language of care was scale, total control, and expansion. The mother, born into another legendary maritime dynasty, existed within the strict confines of European high society, where outward propriety always took precedence over inner feelings. Genuine parental warmth was a scarce resource. Daily upbringing was handled by governesses, among whom the British nanny became the children's main anchor to reality, giving them the simple human affection that their perpetually occupied parents could not provide. In this greenhouse of exceptional privileges, there was no room for ordinary weakness or self-discovery. Immense wealth did not grant freedom. It demanded absolute submission to duty. The boy was expected to become an exact copy of his father, a hard strategist and ruler of the seas, although his own character demanded independence. From an early age, the girl learned a painful lesson. Attention had to be earned by meeting her parents' strict expectations, pressure so great that at 17 she underwent medical correction of her appearance, paid for by her own father. They were not prepared for independent sailing, They were raised as an organic extension of a colossal myth. Their parents' divorce in 1960 merely exposed the hidden cracks in the foundation of this empire. The children remained with their mother, yet their father's invisible hand continued to guide every step, leaving no room for maneuver. They became hostages to a grandiose design, trapped between the demands of the corporation and their own vulnerability. And when a new, world-famous figure entered their orbit, bringing with her the heavy shadow of American political upheavals, the fragile equilibrium of this hothouse world began to collapse. In every great dynasty, there comes a moment when the heir must either dutifully accept the heavy crown or attempt to escape from beneath its crushing shadow. For the young man whose name by right of birth was already inscribed in the registers of the largest ports on the planet, water had always been associated with total control. The ocean belonged entirely to the father. Every sea route was charted, according to the routes of tankers, strictly regulated by multi-million-dollar contracts, and filled with endless, suffocating pressure of expectations. Therefore, the young man turned his gaze high into the sky. Aviation seemed to him the only space where the gravity of the great name ceased to act, where, at the controls of an aeroplane, he could be simply a pilot, making independent decisions, not dictated by the family council at an altitude of several thousand meters. But the illusion of independent separation was shattered against the colossal capabilities of the family patriarch. Noticing his son's insurmountable passion for flying, the father did not straightforwardly forbid it. He acted much more cunningly, and on a larger scale. He simply bought this very sky for him. By founding a national airline and spinning off a separate commercial division from it, the magnate peremptorily appointed his young heir as the head of this complex direction. The rebellion was skillfully, almost imperceptibly, absorbed by the corporate machine. The dream of boundless freedom turned into a new, heavy managerial position, and the cockpit of a light aircraft became just another branch of the father's business, where the young man was to acquire managerial experience at an accelerated pace before the inevitable ascension to the throne of the entire global empire. This fracture of the usual pattern reveals the true, hidden tragedy of the golden boy of the 70s. He was not a destroyer or a classic spoiled rebel squandering his life in idleness and scandals. He sincerely tried to find his own path, prove his professional competence, and gain independence through daily, persistent work. His protest was expressed not in public provocation, but in a quiet, consistent desire to build personal happiness far from intrusive social radars. When he began seeing a woman who was significantly older than him, this provoked furious, almost primal resistance from the father. The head of the family saw in this union a direct threat to his carefully calibrated dynastic plan, completely unwilling to understand that his son was seeking in these relationships not a loud challenge to high society, but a quiet haven, free of falsehood and constant, merciless judgment. The confrontation between two generations, tightly compressed within the narrow confines of one influential family, reached its unpredictable culmination at the end of January 1973. On the concrete runway of Athens' Ellinikon Airport, a light, twin-engine amphibious aircraft of Italian manufacture was preparing for takeoff. It was an entirely routine training flight, a standard check of the equipment before upcoming operational tasks, which foreshadowed absolutely nothing unusual. But within seconds after lifting off the ground, the aircraft suddenly lost control and banked. The tragic events that instantly unfolded before the eyes of stunned witnesses became that very fateful finale, which forever erased all the grandiose strategic plans of the mighty dynasty. The heir's life ended at the age of 24, due to the most severe injuries sustained in the violent impact with the ground. What followed that sorrowful day laid bare the deepest psychological chasm between a man and his illusion of absolute power. The architect of ocean routes, accustomed for decades to solving problems of any global scale with a single telephone call and a checkbook, for the first time in his life, encountered absolute, unyielding insurmountability. He categorically refused to believe that the cause of the aircraft's fall was a simple mechanical malfunction or a random piloting error. His sophisticated mind, shaped in brutal, uncompromising battles for oil flows and political influence, simply could not accept such a simple, ordinary, and senseless outcome. He publicly announced an unprecedented reward of $1 million for providing evidence of external interference and sabotage. This was not merely a logical search for those responsible. It was the desperate, helpless cry of an all-powerful man who suddenly realized that all his colossal wealth could not override the harsh laws of physics or turn back time. The catastrophe in Athens became the most powerful epicenter of a destructive shockwave that forever altered the entire inner landscape of the family. The mother of the deceased young man, a woman whose life had for decades obediently conformed to the strict rules and outward proprieties of European high society, could not withstand the unbearable weight of this sudden loss. Her fragile inner world rapidly descended into the deepest emotional collapse. In desperate attempts to cope with the overwhelming grief and mounting inner despair, she found herself in a hopeless pharmaceutical trap, relying entirely on the artificial energy and artificial sleep provided by heavy prescription drugs. Her once brilliant social life, filled with receptions, turned into a closed, isolated existence in luxurious Paris apartments, where every piece of interior relentlessly reminded her of the irretrievably lost past and shattered hopes. In the autumn of 1974, her life was also tragically cut short due to a critical reaction of her exhausted body to the medications, leaving behind only the bitter, fading echo of a once brilliant destiny. The death of his only, dearly beloved son, and the subsequent quiet passing of the mother, forever broke the invisible inner core on which this entire grandiose structure had rested for many years. The great builder of the commercial fleet, who once radiated inexhaustible, almost frightening vitality, began to fade rapidly and irreversibly. His legendary business acumen noticeably weakened, and his grand ambitions dissolved without a trace in deep, consuming grief. In the spring of 1975, he passed away in a ward of a prestigious Paris hospital due to severe respiratory failure, leaving behind a colossal fortune scattered across the globe and a frightening, ringing emptiness at the very center of his once invincible empire. Suddenly, this enormous, complex mechanism, consisting of hundreds of ocean vessels, global international contracts, intricate corporate intrigues, and multi-million-dollar bank accounts, found itself in the hands of just one person, completely unprepared for it. The 24-year-old girl, who from early childhood had been constantly criticized for not meeting her father's high aesthetic ideals, who had never been seriously considered as the main and sole successor, and who, in an incredibly short time, had lost her entire family, was left alone with the stern board of directors. Around her, a tight ring closed in of elderly, experienced, and ruthless Greek magnates, loyal associates of the late patriarch, who looked at the young heiress with unconcealed, arrogant skepticism, not for a second believing in her ability to hold the heavy helm of this colossal corporate machine. A new battle, hidden from outside eyes, was beginning for the right simply to exist in this cruel world of big money. The heavy oak doors of the boardrooms in Athens and Monaco slammed shut, forever cutting the young heiress off from sympathetic glances from the outside world. Left alone in a closed, cigar-smoke-filled space with the board of directors, the 24-year-old girl faced the icy pragmatism of big international business. Aristotle's men, gray-haired Greek magnates and hardened corporate lawyers who had forged this transnational empire for decades, expected to see a grief-broken victim of tragic circumstances, ready to hand over the helm of control without resistance into their experienced, sinewy hands. They looked at her with unconcealed condescension, as a temporary misunderstanding in their carefully calibrated financial schemes. But it was precisely at this critical, turning-point moment that the deeply buried, steely genetic code of the great dynasty revealed itself. Refusing the role of a weak-willed puppet that would have been convenient for everyone, she began methodically immersing herself in the most complex audit reports, ocean freight schedules, and the intricacies of international tax law. Her first independent test was the execution of the late patriarch's final wishes. According to the will, the colossal fortune was not simply passing into one pair of hands. It was divided exactly in half. 50% of the assets became her sole property, while the other 50% served as a solid, unbreakable foundation for the creation of the Alexander Onassis Public Benefit Foundation. This was an incredibly complex legal and humanitarian structure that, contrary to all pessimistic forecasts, survived, and over time became one of the largest charitable organizations in Greece, funding education, medicine, and the arts. Preserving the balance between ruthless business and large-scale philanthropy became her invisible triumph, proving that the empire had not collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions, but had transformed into something new. However, the greatest, most exhausting test of strength was not the grueling corporate routine, but the bitter legal war with a figure who aroused in the heiress the deepest, almost physical, inner rejection. The former First Lady of the United States of America, who had become her father's last wife, was perceived by the girl not simply as a claimant to part of the assets, but as a harbinger of irreversible catastrophe. In the heiress's mind, this elegant woman in dark glasses was the bearer of the heavy aura of overseas political tragedies that had destroyed their fragile family order. Their confrontation, which unfolded in courtrooms from 1975 to 1977, became a classic clash between two entirely different worlds. On one side stood the flawless, polished facade of the American political elite. On the other, a wounded, vulnerable, yet infinitely proud Greek nature defending its territory. The heiress displayed an incredible, frightening toughness, methodically buying her family's independence from an outsider's presence. The final settlement resolving all claims under American and Greek law cost her the astronomical sum, for that time, of $26 million in compensation. Yet the main, true triumph of this exhausting deal was not the saved corporate shares, but that very uncompromising clause completely prohibiting visits to the family island of Scorpios without her personal, prior written permission. She literally bought the right to permanently erase the foreign woman's name from the history of her land, proving to the old directors that she could defend the empire's borders as fiercely and peremptorily as her late father had done. But every battle won on the external front inexorably drained her inner reserves, day after day. Having achieved a historic victory in the brutal male-dominated business, she found herself in an absolute, ringing life vacuum. The paradox of exceptional wealth lies in its ability to erect insurmountable walls of gold around a person, completely cutting them off from simple human joys and sincere, selfless attachments. The girl whose mere name made stockbrokers in London and New York tense remained, deep down, the same insecure teenager. Her father's harsh, sometimes tactless criticism of her weight and appearance left indelible, aching scars on her self-esteem. Trying to meet the imposed standards of high society, while simultaneously coping with the colossal stress of daily management of a giant fleet, she gradually descended into a treacherous pharmaceutical trap. Heavy prescription drugs that granted artificial sleep after endless flights, and specific medical agents for radical weight loss became her inseparable companions. This dangerous, destructive dependence on medical support was not a manifestation of spoiledness or ordinary weakness of will. It was a desperate, doomed way to force her deeply exhausted body to function at the merciless pace dictated by the global corporation. Doctors at leading Swiss clinics officially recorded her as suffering from the most severe clinical depression, attempting to return the patient to normal reality. Yet the artificial energy provided only a temporary, very fragile illusion of life stability. In search of emotional salvation, she repeatedly tried to build personal happiness, entering into marriages that seemed hasty to the society pages. But behind each of her marriages lay not the whim of a millionairess, but the cry for help of a lonely person desperately seeking unconditional love. And yet, through this dense veil of melancholy, a ray of hope once broke through. In January 1985, she became a mother, naming her newborn daughter after her family. The arrival of the child promised to break the chain of tragedies and bring long-awaited peace. But the mechanism of inexorable fate had already begun its final, soundless countdown, preparing the empire for its most unexpected trial. The girl, born in 1985, from the very first days of her existence became the center of the universe for a woman whose heart had seemed to harden completely in the cold boardrooms of corporate directors. The heiress of the giant shipping corporation experienced for the first time the unconditional love of which she had been cruelly deprived in her own childhood. She guarded the infant with frightening, almost manic care, attempting to build around her daughter an invisible barrier of tenderness and absolute security, shielding her from the toxic attention of the world press and the pressure of enormous expectations. But it was precisely at this moment, when long-awaited family equilibrium seemed about to arrive, that the physical consequences of years of destructive stress asserted themselves with inexorable, chilling directness. In November 1988, the owner of the empire traveled to Argentina. This was not an official business trip or another social event widely covered in the society columns. She stayed in a quiet, cozy suburb of Buenos Aires, in the spacious home of her long-time, devoted friends, trying to find a little peace far from European paparazzi. The atmosphere of that warm southern evening foreshadowed absolutely nothing alarming. However, years of exhausting struggle with complexes, constant, merciless weight fluctuations, and prolonged, forced intake of specific medical medications had imperceptibly, but critically, worn out her heart muscle. The artificial energy that had sustained her in the ranks during corporate negotiations for decades ultimately turned against her. On November 19th, her life was tragically cut short in the guest room of someone else's house due to an acute bodily reaction that led to severe pulmonary edema. The official autopsy, scrupulously conducted by Argentine Judge Alberto Piotti, clearly and unambiguously ruled out any direct fatal error with a prescription at the time of the incident. The cause of the tragic finale was not a sudden medical crisis, but the deep, irreversible exhaustion of the vital resources of the 37-year-old woman, whose body simply could not withstand the burden of the colossal responsibility placed upon her. Death in solitude against the backdrop of astronomical wealth became a terrible, melancholic chord, concluding the story of the second golden heir of the dynasty. And once again, as many years before, with frightening cyclical precision, the 3-year-old child was left without her closest person, finding herself alone with the frighteningly enormous trust fund and the complex, binding historical legacy of her family. How to break this closed circle of losses and disappointments? How to survive in the shadow of a great name when every action of yours is examined through the magnifying glass of global financial expectations? The third figure of this large-scale family saga, the sole living heiress of the empire, chose an entirely unprecedented path. Having gained access to resources capable of easily altering political landscapes, she became neither a rebel nor a continuer of the global ambitions of her famous grandfather. Her main, most conscious decision in life was a radical, uncompromising refusal of public fame in favor of a simple human existence. This girl, born in January 1985, had witnessed the consequences of absolute power through the fates of her closest people. As she grew older, she began methodically, step by step, dismantling the shining yet suffocating facade that had once destroyed her relatives. She did not rebuild frigates into super yachts, and did not become entangled in public, scandalous wars for influence in boardrooms. Instead, she immersed herself in the quiet, disciplined world of professional equestrian sports, finding in the strict routine of training the predictability and honesty that her family history had so lacked. Horses were not interested in her bank account and did not read articles in financial bulletins. Here, everything depended only on personal labor and endurance. But the most telling, symbolic act of emancipation was the fate of that very same famous island of Scorpios, the family nest where destinies were decided, historical deals were concluded, and where the former First Lady of the United States of America found her final resting place. In 2013, the heiress coolly, without unnecessary sentiment, sold this piece of land to a Russian billionaire. This was not just an ordinary real estate transaction. It was an act of final, irrevocable farewell to heavy historical baggage. The sale of the sets for a drama in which she no longer wished to take any part. Having become invisible to the broad public, she gained her greatest achievement, the possibility of being an ordinary person. Against the backdrop of the madness that had surrounded her dynasty for decades, this demonstrative, chosen normality seems a true miracle, and the boldest, most conscious manifestation of freedom. She did not run away from reality. She simply chose a different reality, where success is measured not by the tonnage of oil tankers, but by a simple, peaceful morning without camera flashes. The family history, which began with the grandiose, titanic ambitions of one man and raced through a series of crushing personal catastrophes, found its resolution in a quiet, conscious retreat into the shadows. Many chroniclers of social life make the same crude, unforgivable mistake when they try to sum up this grandiose saga. They claim that with the departure of the last golden heirs, the great maritime empire simply collapsed under the weight of its own sins, rotted from within, and dissolved without a trace into history. But this is only a convenient, cinematic myth that has nothing in common with harsh financial reality. The truth is that the tragedy of this family always remained deeply personal, while the corporate machine demonstrated a frightening, almost inhuman vitality. Capital on such a scale does not know how to grieve. It only knows how to transform. When the founder of the dynasty realized that no amount of millions could bring his son, killed in an air crash, back to life, he committed an act that forever changed the structure of Greek business. Having no way to resurrect a man of flesh and blood, he resurrected him in the form of a monumental legal entity. Exactly half of the entire global fortune was severed from direct inheritance and transferred into the Alexander Onassis Public Benefit Foundation. This was an act of colossal despair, cast in the strict form of a corporate charter. The old patriarch seemed to be trying to buy off eternity by creating a structure that was meant to outlive everyone. And the plan worked with frightening flawlessness. While the newspapers savored the details of the personal crises of the remaining family members, the foundation methodically grew its assets. The organization, born from the deepest parental grief, began building modern cardiac surgery centers, awarding thousands of educational scholarships, and financing large-scale cultural initiatives around the world. The name of the young man whose life was tragically cut short on the runway was forever inscribed not in the crime chronicles, but on the facades of hospitals and libraries. A striking, surreal contrast emerged. The dead heir acquired the status of an eternal, ideal philanthropist, while the living heiress was forced to battle daily against the sharks of the global shipping industry. There is yet another unfair stereotype that portrays the second heiress solely as a broken, depressive victim of circumstances, incapable of managing the enterprise. The documentary archives and ocean freight schedules from the late 70s and early 80s completely dismantle this one-sided image. Upon assuming ownership, this young woman displayed a grip that made the old Greek magnates turn pale. In the era of the severest global energy crisis, when dozens of shipping companies were declaring bankruptcy, she did not merely keep the empire afloat, she initiated a large-scale modernization of the fleet, disposed of outdated vessels, and bet on modern, more efficient tankers. She ruthlessly dismissed those board members who tried to manipulate her, and personally conducted grueling negotiations with representatives of the oil cartels. In the boardrooms, she was truly her father's daughter, unyielding, sharp, and absolutely pragmatic. She proved to the entire patriarchal world of big money that she was capable of carrying this colossal weight on her shoulders. A villain to competitors and an insurmountable barrier to raiders, she became a true savior for thousands of her corporation's employees. But it was precisely this incredible professional success that made her personal drama even more poignant. The human psyche cannot function indefinitely in the mode of a besieged fortress. Returning after tough, hours-long negotiations to her empty, luxurious apartments, the brilliant strategist and tough executive would once again turn into an infinitely lonely woman, searching for simple warmth. The series of her marriages was not a consequence of frivolity, as the tabloids of the time tried to portray it. It was a desperate, methodical search for normality. She sincerely tried to buy what most people receive completely free of charge: loyalty, care, and the illusion of protection. Every new union began with enormous hope, and inevitably shattered against the invisible wall of her status. The men who entered her life sooner or later broke under the weight of her name, her fortune, or her own deeply rooted fears of betrayal. She was too influential to be simply sympathized with, and too vulnerable to withstand the constant focus of public attention. Dependence on heavy prescription drugs became her only artificial way to regulate this unbearable difference in potential between her external steel armor and her inner fragility. This is a story not of weakness, but of the limits of human capabilities. Even the most brilliant mind and the most unlimited financial resources proved powerless before the elementary need to be simply loved, without regard to stock quotes and lawsuits. To fully grasp the scale of this historical drama, it is necessary to abandon the modern psychological approach and look at what happened through the rigid lens of the post-war era. The 60s and 70s of the 20th century were a time of unprecedented political tension and the formation of new global elites. The rules of the game were written on the fly, and the boundaries of what was permissible were determined solely by the volume of capital and political weight. In this atmosphere of total expansion and the formation of new rules of the game, interpersonal relations within great dynasties operated according to the laws of Machiavellian diplomacy rather than family psychotherapy. Take, for example, the appearance of the former American First Lady in the tight, closed world of the Greek maritime empire. For newspaper headlines, it was the perfect, glittering romance of two global icons. But behind closed doors, the event was perceived quite differently. For the children of the dynasty's founder, this marriage became the final, crushing confirmation that their father viewed the family not as a quiet haven, but as another tool for expanding his global influence. Marrying the most famous widow in America was not so much an act of love as a brilliant, cynical geopolitical investment, an attempt to purchase absolute immunity and the highest status in international political circles. This step triggered the deepest rift. The younger generation saw in this union a direct betrayal of their mother's memory and a crude intrusion of an alien, potentially dangerous force into their already fragile world. The legend of the curse supposedly brought by the American guest was not a mystical invention, but a tangible fear of the heavy political baggage she unwittingly dragged behind her. This woman, who had endured monstrous public tragedies in her own country, sought in marriage to the Greek magnate a reliable refuge and financial security. She too was a hostage to circumstances, trying to survive under the conditions offered. The clash of these two different survival strategies, the young heiress fiercely defending her territory, and the older woman seeking peace behind the stone wall of another's wealth, became the inevitable consequence of the very climate their father had shaped for decades. Aristotle was not a villain in the classical sense of the word. He was a hostage to his own genius and his own ambitions. A man who had risen from poverty and exile, who had built an empire with his own hands, he sincerely believed that total control was the only form of expressing care. He did not know how to love, except by dominating. By giving his daughter a yacht worth millions of dollars, he was not simply making a gift. He was erecting a golden cage, the keys to which always remained only in his hands. He demanded the impossible from his children, to be independent individuals, yet to obey his will without question. This internal paradox became the invisible mine that tore the family apart from within. The complexity of this story lies in the fact that it is impossible to divide the participants into the right and the guilty. Each of them acted according to their own deeply suffered truth. The mother, unable to cope with the loss of her son and sinking into isolation, was a victim of a system in which women of high society had no right to public weakness. The heir, who tried to break free into the sky, was a hero whose attempt to gain freedom collided with harsh reality. The daughter who won back the empire was a brilliant warrior on the corporate battlefield, but a completely defenseless person within the walls of her own home. Even the most controversial, harsh decisions, such as the payment of multi-million-dollar compensation and the ban on visiting the grave, were dictated not by ordinary greed or revenge, but by a desperate desire to preserve at least a drop of identity, to protect the boundaries of her personal space from the intrusion of outsiders. It was a cry for independence, cast in the strict paragraphs of a legal document. All these people, possessing resources capable of changing the course of history, ultimately proved powerless before the simplest, most basic human fears. The fear of loss, the fear of loneliness, and the fear of failing to meet the expectations of those they loved. Their fates are the perfect, frighteningly precise illustration of how boundless power and colossal wealth become not protection, but a magnifying glass, that multiplies any internal crack many times over, turning it into an insurmountable abyss. The folder containing the typewritten text of the 1977 agreement, preserved in the court archives, today looks merely like a yellowed artifact of a bygone era. The signatures have faded, and the amount of compensation, once considered astronomical, has long ceased to astonish the imagination in the world of modern technology corporations. But this document still carries enormous historical and semantic weight. In its dry, uncompromising formulations, that very moment is forever captured when a young woman tried to buy the right to her own story, erasing from it the shadows of the past. It was an act of absolute, almost desperate strength, dictated by the deepest inner pain. The empire, built on total control and grandiose ambitions, never succeeded in providing its creators with the one thing that mattered most: immunity from the laws of human nature. Neither the millions of dollars in bank accounts, nor private islands, nor fleets of transoceanic vessels became insurance against loneliness, illness, and tragic accidents. The mechanisms of big business continued to function flawlessly, while the living people who ran them broke under the unbearable weight of the responsibility placed upon them. The tragedy of this dynasty lies not in a mystical curse, and not in the evil intent of competitors. It lies in the illusion that absolute power can replace absolute love, and that large-scale corporate successes can compensate for the lack of simple human warmth. The children, raised on the deck of the most luxurious yacht in the world, surrounded by world politicians and first-magnitude stars, were completely unprepared for a collision with a reality in which not everything can be solved with a checkbook or a call to an influential patron. They became hostages of the grandiose myth created by their father, forced all their lives to compete with his gigantic shadow. One tried to break free from this shadow into the sky, but his flight was cut short by a fatal finale on a concrete runway. The second accepted the fight, achieved victory in the brutal world of business, but was never able to conquer her own demons, meeting her end in someone else's house on the other side of the world. Looking back at this history, we see a complex, multifaceted kaleidoscope of fates, where there are no simple answers and no unambiguous judgments. We see the old patriarch, whose grief after the death of his son gave birth to one of the greatest charitable organizations of our time. We see the tough heiress, defending her corporation from raiders, who at the same time desperately needed medication just to fall asleep. We see the third figure, the only one left alive, who committed the most radical and courageous act. She renounced publicity, sold the legendary island, and chose a quiet life far from social radars. Their history does not fit into the banal moral that money does not bring happiness. It is a much deeper and more frightening lesson about the limits of human endurance. About the fact that any resources, even the most colossal, are powerless in the face of genuine grief, and that the golden walls built around oneself inevitably turn one day into prison bars. This saga forces us to reflect on the true price of ambitions, on what we leave to our children, freedom of choice, or the weight of our own unfulfilled expectations. Observing the fate of this dynasty, the viewer experiences a complex, contradictory cocktail of feelings. We condemn their arrogance and cruelty, tremble before their will and determination, and at the same time feel the deepest compassion for their desperate, doomed attempts to find personal happiness. Behind every loud newspaper headline, behind every multi-million-dollar contract, lived vulnerable people who simply wanted to be loved, not for their name or for the number of zeros in their bank account, but simply for who they truly were. And in this realization lies the true, cleansing catharsis of this great, sad story.